I once thought marriage was the final chapter, the sanctuary where you could stop searching, stop doubting, and finally exhale. But the reality is, silence can thunder louder than any argument in a house where love has faded. That silence became my constant shadow. My name is Hannah. I'm 42, married for 7 years, and lately, more of a ghost wandering through my own home than a wife in love. My husband Richard carries presence when it comes to status and bank accounts, but when it comes to emotion, he's been gone for years. What began as late-night phone calls and surprise kisses faded into cold nods and murmured, "I'll be home late." Richard was never cruel, but he was finished. Finished with us, with trying. He buried himself in meetings, work trips, and scotch. I, in turn, buried myself in cooking meals he wouldn't touch and folding clothes he hardly wore. The nights weighed the most. Lying in bed alone, staring at the ceiling fan, I wondered how a marriage could feel so crowded with silence and yet so unbearably heavy. Then Jason arrived. He was Richard's son from his first marriage, 22, fresh out of college, searching for his next step. I didn't know him well. He was polite, reserved, and called me Hannah instead of stepmom, which I silently appreciated. I had no wish to play a role I never agreed to. At first, his presence was just a faint reminder in the hallway, the creak of a door past midnight, a cereal bowl abandoned in the sink. Slowly, though, I noticed him noticing me. One afternoon, he found me hunched over the kitchen sink, trying to fix a stubborn leak, with nothing but YouTube and frustration. "Need some help?" he asked casually. "No, I've got it." I lied, sleeves soaked through. But he didn't leave. He knelt beside me, tightened something I hadn't even seen was loose, and then smiled. There. Done. That moment lingered longer than it should have. It wasn't romance. It wasn't desire. But it was something I hadn't felt in years seen. Still, I held back. I was the adult, the wife, the responsible one. Or so I reminded myself. The real fracture came on our anniversary. Richard promised he'd be home early. I wore the dress he once admired years ago, lit candles, cooked his favorite dish from scratch. 10 minutes late, then 30, then an hour. Finally, a text. "Meeting ran late. Don't wait up." No apology, no explanation, just 6 words that cut. I stood there, staring at the table. Candles burning low, wine untouched. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply went to the cabinet, poured myself a glass, then another, and another. Sip by sip, I replayed every slammed door, every empty night, every hollow excuse. The house felt colder than ever. I was slumped on the couch when Jason walked in. His eyes swept the room, dim light, empty bottles, untouched food, and then rested on me. Barefoot, mascara streaked, half laughing and half crying into my 3rd glass. "Rough night?" he asked. Not mocking, just sincere. I squinted at him. "Do you know today's our anniversary?" He paused. "No, I didn't. Neither did Richard, apparently." I shouldn't have said it, but I didn't care anymore. The wine loosened everything I'd caged inside. Jason stepped closer cautiously, like approaching a storm he hadn't caused, but refused to ignore. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I gave a bitter laugh. "Do I look okay?" He didn't answer. I stared upward and whispered, "I don't know why I'm never enough. I did everything right." Jason didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. The silence between us was nothing like the one with Richard. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. "I don't think it's about you," he said softly. I turned my head, our eyes meeting. For once, someone actually saw me. "I'm just tired," I whispered. "Tired of pretending this is a life." His expression didn't shift, but his tone softened. "You don't have to pretend with me. I don't remember much afterward. Maybe he covered me with a blanket. Maybe he turned off the lights. But I remember my last words before drifting off. Why doesn't anyone want me anymore?" The room was still, but something stirred, something unnamed, burning quietly in the dark. Morning came with a dull ache in my head, and a sharper one in my chest. I woke on the couch, still in last night's dress. A blanket was draped over me. The bottles were gone, the lights off, and on the coffee table sat a half glass of water, waiting, still full. My head was hazy, but one memory burned sharp and clear. Jason's eyes steady, full of something I hadn't been given in years: concern. I pushed myself upright slowly, heat rushing to my cheeks. I'd embarrassed myself. Worse, I had unraveled in front of my stepson. In the kitchen, Jason stood at the stove, scrambling eggs as though it were any other morning. When he noticed me, he didn't comment. He simply nodded toward a fresh mug of coffee, waiting on the counter. "Figured you could use this," he said. "Thanks," I mumbled, ashamed. There was a pause, quiet but heavy, before I found my voice. "About last night." "You don't need to explain," he cut in gently. "Everyone breaks sometimes." I wasn't sure what startled me more, his calm maturity or how natural it felt being around him. "Still," I whispered, eyes down. "I shouldn't have said all that." I crossed a line. He placed a plate before me and shrugged. Honestly, it was the first honest thing I've heard in this house for weeks. Just like that, the wall between us cracked. In the days after, something shifted. We never spoke of that night again, but a quiet understanding grew between us. Jason didn't keep his distance. Instead, he lingered. After dinner, he'd stay to watch my shows, offer to wash dishes when I was too tired. He noticed the smallest things Richard never had. "You changed your hair," he said once. I smiled faintly, just added a few layers. "Looks good," he replied, plain, honest. Another evening, I was reorganizing the living room shelves when Jason walked in from a run. Shirt damp, sweat glistening along his neck. "Really committing to the great reshelving?" he teased, grabbing water. "Well, someone has to care about this house," I replied too quickly. His smile faded, then quietly, "You deserve someone who does." My chest tightened. That night, Richard called not to ask about me, not to acknowledge our anniversary disaster, only to announce he'd be extending his business trip. "We'll celebrate when I'm back," he said. No apology, no affection, just distance. I sat frozen after the call, glass of water in hand. Jason found me in the living room. "He's staying longer," I muttered without looking up. He didn't press, just sat beside me. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. "I don't get it," I whispered suddenly. I gave him everything. My loyalty, my best years. And somehow I'm a stranger in my own skin. Jason studied me, then said words I'd never forget. "You didn't lose yourself because of him, Hannah. You buried parts of yourself so deep, you forgot they were still there." I blinked. No one had ever said my name like that before, not with that kind of care. We sat in silence until his arm brushed mine. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't move when lightning cracked and the power snapped out. I jumped, startled. Jason chuckled. "Perfect. Candlelight dinner, round 2. We lit candles, sat down with leftovers. It felt strange, intimate, but we pretended it wasn't. I poured us each a small glass of wine. "To the forgotten parts of ourselves," I said softly, raising mine. He tapped his against mine, "and to finding them again." Later, we moved to the couch. Rain tapped against the windows like a metronome. We talked about everything: his struggles with job hunting, my long-abandoned dream of opening a bakery. With each word, another layer peeled away. At one point, I laughed too hard, leaning into him, my head resting lightly on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't pull away. My heart hammered with the terrifying truth of how right it felt. "I miss being held," I whispered. "I miss being seen." His voice was low. "You're not invisible to me, Hannah." We turned at the same time, faces close, breath mingling. For a heartbeat, it felt impossible not to close the space. Then Jason blinked, stood abruptly, and muttered, "I should get some sleep." I nodded, lips parted, unsure if I was relieved or aching. "Good night," he said softly from the doorway. "Good night," I answered. The moment lingered, delicate as perfume in the air. The following days were filled with practiced calm. Jason and I moved around each other, pretending nothing had shifted, when everything had. The tension wasn't sharp. It was magnetic, constant. I found myself glancing into rooms before entering, hoping to see him, bracing when I did. Every glance across the kitchen, every accidental brush of fingers, it was always there, unspoken. Then Friday night came. Jason arrived late, rain-soaked, hair dripping, grin wide. He'd been offered a job out of state. They want me to start next month. Big move, he said, tossing keys onto the counter. I forced a smile. That's great. He studied me, brow furrowing. You don't sound thrilled. I bit my lip. Just surprised. He stepped closer. You're the only one I wanted to tell face to face. I owed you that. The weight of it settled thick in the air. Instinctively, I poured 2 glasses of wine. We sat near the fireplace, the storm still knocking out power. Only flames to light the room. Shadows swayed along the walls. My pulse was wild. Jason spoke of starting fresh, of chasing something new. But his words kept circling back to me. I thought you were just sad, he admitted. But you're not. You're starving. I lifted my eyes. Starving for what? His gaze held mine. For someone to remind you that you're alive. The wine sat between us, untouched now. His eyes were fixed on mine. He wasn't just Richard's son anymore, and I wasn't only his father's wife. I shouldn't feel this way, I whispered. I know, he breathed. Then words disappeared because he kissed me. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't forced. It wasn't reckless or loud or clumsy. It was steady, trembling, and unbearably real. His lips touched mine like a question he was terrified to voice. My body stiffened, but I didn't retreat. I let myself surrender. Every ache, every hunger, every spark that had been suffocating inside us for weeks. When his hand brushed my cheek, something deep within me cracked open. I wasn't thinking of Richard. I wasn't thinking of shame. I was thinking only of what it meant to be wanted genuinely, wholly wanted. We said nothing. We didn't have to. We moved like 2 souls who had waited too long for something they thought was forever out of reach. And then, as quickly as it began, it ended. Morning came, and I woke in my bed, alone. The silence pressed around me, heavier than ever. Jason's belongings were gone. On the kitchen counter lay a folded note. Hannah, last night wasn't wrong, but it can't happen again. You gave me something I'll never forget, but I couldn't stay and pretend. I hope one day you feel free again. Alive again. Jason. I read it 3 times before lowering myself into a chair. No tears came. Only quiet. But it wasn't the same emptiness. Not cold, not hollow, just still. That evening, Richard returned. He came in, kissed the top of my head in his absent-minded way, and asked, You all right? You seem different. I studied him, this man I had once adored, who hadn't truly asked about me in years. I'm fine, I answered softly. Just tired. He didn't probe further. He never did. Weeks slipped back into routine. But inside, something was altered. I stopped waiting at the door. I stopped preparing elaborate dinners he'd ignore. I began walking in the mornings. I devoured books again. I filled pages in a journal. Sometimes I lingered outside Jason's empty room. Not with sorrow, but with thanks. He hadn't broken me. He had reminded me. I was still alive. Still a woman. Still deserving of feeling. One morning, a letter arrived, forwarded from his new job. Inside was a photo signed of a bakery window, with a note scribbled on the back. Saw this, and thought of you. Maybe it's not too late. A smile pulled at my lips. Richard walked past, glanced at me. What's that? Just an old memory, I replied, tucking the photo into my journal. That night, I poured a glass of water instead of wine, and sat beneath the stars on the patio. I wasn't proud of every choice I'd made, but I couldn't regret them either, because it had never truly been about betrayal. It had always been about waking,